Welcome to the Priesthood Men podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. This is a place where members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have an opportunity to gather together and share our Latter-day Saint stories in hopes that we can build each other's faith and draw nearer to Jesus Christ. As his disciples, our hope is to make discipleship our highest priority. And so we're so grateful that you guys are tuning in. Our guest tonight, Dr. Jordan Jensen, is a wonderful friend of ours and a friend of the family. And I'm so excited to interview him and get to learn a little bit more about his path and his Latter-day Saint story and journey.
For sure. Thank you so much, Bradley. It's great to be with you. I wanted to just take a few minutes and share some of the love that I have for the Vega family. I've actually had the pleasure of seeing mom, dad, and all three sons just in the last 3 days. And they're spread throughout different cities. So the odds of that are not good, but it's been a blessing to be able to do so. And I've had a chance to serve on the Stake High Council with Darren, his father, and also to work in his father and his mother's ward, as well as do some work in his other brother's ward, who is a branch president out in the Okeechobee branch. And I've also had a chance to get to know Brian as well through various interactions. And I just love the Vega family. I admire them. I respect them. They're stalwarts in the church here in South Florida, much like my wife's parents, people that have been here for several decades and just really been a stone of strength for this area and been mentors for my wife and I, who, hope to be able to follow that pattern and to be that kind of solid example. Love their family, and it's just an honor to be on the Priesthood Men. I remember Elder Ronald Rasband, giving a talk once in General Conference, and he made the comment that he's kind of always had a testimony, even from the time he was really young. And that's sort of my story. I was similar to that, but there's a lot of footnotes that go along with that. And what I'd like to do tonight is share what some of those footnotes are, because no matter how young you may gain your testimony or how strong you may think it is when you're young, life's going to throw curveballs at you.
Sure.
In the book of Helaman, chapter 5, it doesn't say if the storms come, if the winds beat upon you.
When they do.
It says when they do. That's exactly right. And so I think what I'd like to share tonight is the nature of those challenges that I've faced over the years, because even though I have, in a sense, always had a testimony, obviously that testimony has had ups and downs, and it's a circuitous journey for all of us, no matter what our background, no matter who our parents were. And mine is no different. So I was initially born into a family, the one of the youngest children, 6 of 7 kids. And my family was strong in the church. We had ancestral roots that ran deep on both sides of the family, back to the earliest days of the church. And that was a positive thing, but there were some negative things that came out of that, in the sense that there was a culture that developed in my family a little bit. As great as they were, I had great parents, I had great siblings. Like I said, I had a lot of great ancestors. But there was also a little bit of a culture that infiltrated that. And I think that we as siblings grew up a little bit thinking that we were, somehow the perfect Mormon family or the ideal Mormon family, and that we were somehow above the fray. And to a lesser or greater extent, I think we all kind of cultivated that attitude. I know I did.
Do you think that showed up outside of the home setting? Did other people maybe ever think that, do you think?
I certainly hope not, but in all honesty, I'm sure it did. And, all of us have, as we look back into our past, we all have cringeworthy moments where we wish we could go back and do things differently or say things differently, or quite frankly, be differently, have a different attitude, be more humble, be more loving, be more Christ-like. So it's hard to say, because I was on the inside, not the outside, but I am sure that it came across negatively to others in a variety of different ways. And I'm ashamed and embarrassed to say that, but this is part of my imperfection. This was part of my family's imperfection. And an event happened when I was in college that really started to check this problem that I think that we had. And that event is that my parents, after about 10 years of a lot of ups and downs in the marriages, and over time more downs than ups, They split up in 2003. And in 2004, their divorce was finalized. And this shook our family in a really significant way, and a lot of different ways. It made things more complicated with grandkids. It made things more complicated with future family get-togethers, and divorce always brings with it a number of different challenges, as anybody who's gone through divorce knows and understands, and that's a lot of people. I'm certainly not alone in this, but it was a real catalyst for change throughout my family, and certainly for me, because I realized when I went through this adversity, I realized very clearly that we were not a perfect Mormon family. We weren't even the ideal Mormon family. And that really interrupted our paradigm because we kind of pridefully, whether intentionally or not, we had kind of pridefully cultivated that growing up. But all of a sudden, my whole life paradigm is shifting because I realize that, I'm not better than other people. Jensens aren't better than other people. We're just human beings and children of God like everybody else. We're prone to mistakes. We're prone to failure. We're prone to temptation. We're prone to everything that everybody else is. And while that was obviously the divorce in the family brought about a lot of negatives, it also became a seedbed for a whole bunch of positive things. And one of those positive things for me was recognizing that even the people that are nearest and dearest to you, and don't get me wrong, I love and adore my parents. My parents are getting up in age, and at both of their funerals, I already know what I'm going to say. And I'm going to say, my parents weren't perfect, but somehow they were perfect for me. And I mean that with all of my heart. They're not perfect people. I'm not a perfect person. None of us are perfect, but my parents did the best that they could. They did their imperfect best, and part of that imperfection, led to a divorce. But I'm so grateful for that because it gave me an opportunity to sort of restart and recognize and start approaching life instead of thinking that I was, somehow better than others, or that I somehow, had this edge up on the fray over other people. I realized, no, I'm just like everybody else. And I need my savior as much as anybody. And part of this realization came from the fact that my parents, I mean, your parents are your parents, and they are going to be a huge part of your life, whether for positive or negative or both, everybody. And so when that happened, it was a recognition that sometimes even the people that you're closest to, sometimes even the people that you love and trust the most, sometimes the people that you think will never let you down will let you down. And that's not necessarily because they're bad people, it's just because they're human beings, like all of us. And it helped me to reshift my focus and realize that, you know what, I can't put my faith and trust unequivocally in any human being. I have to put my faith and trust unequivocally in someone that is perfect and does not change. And nobody on this earth applies. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, we need to be able to trust those that we love, and we need to be willing to extend trust. It's very unhealthy if we don't trust anybody. But the point I'm trying to make here is that theoretically, any mortal person can let you down. But I realized that, wow, while that is true, I also have this faith that I've always had a testimony of, I've always believed in, but it took on a whole new meaning for me because all of a sudden I realized this Jesus figure that I've been taught about all my life is not just a cool story in the scriptures or something that I feel the Spirit testify of. This is a perfect being who can be there for me when even those nearest and dearest may not be able to for whatever reason, or may let me down, or may compromise trust. And that was just a really powerful testimony building experience. And then in addition to that, my parents got divorced at a time in my life where I was anxiously engaged trying to figure out my own life. I was in college. What am I going to major in? What's my career going to be? Who am I going to marry? And I did get married 4 years later after they got divorced. And my wife and I have been married 17 years now. And there's no perfect marriage in this world. I like to say, if you have a perfect marriage, then you're either a lot better than me, or someone in the relationship is not thinking fully for themselves. Because no matter who you are as a human being, there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be an adversity. My wife and I have experienced those things. We also have a wonderful relationship. We have a great marriage. We have 3 wonderful children. But one of the reasons that we do have these things is that for the last 17 years, I've been approaching my marriage with a great deal of humility, recognizing that, hey, if it could happen to my parents, it could happen to anybody else, right? Including me.
Sure.
And that's where it really became personalized, as I realized that, again, I'm not better than anybody else. I'm just an imperfect human being, son of God. But I have been blessed, unusually blessed, to have the knowledge of the restored gospel, to have the words of the scriptures, to have the words of the general authorities, to have the words of the local authorities and all the people that have been good examples to me. And this is the bedrock, this is the foundation of my marriage, which, admittedly imperfect, has still been able to be very successful and now has 3 children that we love. And I'm very grateful for that marriage and for its strength. And I actually, indirectly attribute my success to the lessons that I learned from my parents' divorce.
As you tell that story, I think to myself, you seem to have a way of explaining these, what most people would deem negative or bad experiences, right? And then kind of just rolling right into how they had a positive impact on your life. And I just find that to be interesting because most people would have more of a complaining attitude. So I just wonder that approach to kind of seeing the brighter side of things, where did that come from? Is that something that is kind of just natural to you, that you've always kind of just seen the brighter side of things, or is that something that you attribute to the gospel?
That's a really good question. I think it's a little of both. I mean, I think naturally I do tend to be a native optimist, but more so than that, I attribute it to just an awful lot of practice. Because the natural human response when you face a difficulty, when you face a challenge, is to complain, is to whine, is to moan and to groan. And believe me, I've done my share of it throughout my life. I'm a lot better now than I used to be because of my experiences. But again, I attribute my ability to practice it, my consistency in practice, and my desire to practice that to the gospel and to all of the people in my life who have been gospel mentors, because that's what the gospel teaches. The gospel teaches optimism, the gospel teaches hope. But the gospel also doesn't hide the challenges or try to put skeletons in the closet. It recognizes, we've got to deal with these things. And speaking of that, that's actually probably a really good segue, because another thing that I felt impressed to talk about tonight, with your permission, is another experience that I've had with mental illness, something that has been a huge struggle for me, but that I have been able to do some things with and ultimately turn it into a positive. And is it okay if I talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yes, please do. I know that unnumbered, untold numbers of people are struggling with mental health issues, especially in 2025. So, any hope that you can give us concerning those topics would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I couldn't agree more about the relevance of the subject to our time. It seems to be the great challenge of our time. In my parents' generation, it was polio or measles, or in generations before that, smallpox. So every generation has had its challenge, but it does indeed seem, as science and medicine and technology have wiped out a lot of those things in the developed world, it seems like mental health and emotional health, social health even, is the real challenge of our time. And therein lies part of the positive in my experience, because I'm seeing already a lot of the ways in which the Lord is using me as a tool to be able to help those who similarly suffer. And while I wouldn't wish what I've been through on anybody, because it's been awful.
It seems hopeless, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, when you're in the midst of it, I mean, there's a reason why it leads to suicide for an unfortunate number of people, and obviously, whatever work I do is in hopes of bringing those numbers down and giving hope to others, because I have found a lot of hope and I have found a lot of capacity to be able to manage. And the key word there is manage, because in most cases, you don't ever completely wipe out mental illness. You learn to manage it through professional help, through self-help, through relationship help, through gospel help, through the empowerment of the atonement. We learn to manage these things. And, I'm at a point now where I have it 85, 90, 95% managed instead of 15, 20, 25.
Yeah, I mean, you don't seem very crazy to me, JJ, right now. And, it could be that you just took a deep breath before you got here. But you strike me as someone who has a very calm, inviting, and trustworthy demeanor. And that's just from the little bit of time that I've gotten to spend with you and from watching the reactions of other people as they associate and spend time with you. And so, um, so what I forget where I was going with that. Forgive me. We'll edit that out, JJ. But
Actually, I hope you don't edit that part out, because I really appreciate it and it means a lot to me. And the reason it does is that the reason for, if I have any polish, if I have any refinement, if I have any peace and tranquility at this point in time, I attribute it to, in large part, 35 years of practice. It didn't happen overnight, and it's still a work in progress, but it means a lot to me to hear you say that, because that's positive feedback for me that says, "Jordan, you're on the right track." And it's a continual battle for the rest of my life. I don't anticipate that these mental and emotional challenges will fully lift until the veil is lifted and the resurrection. We all have our crosses to bear, and I will always bear this one to some extent. But it's night and day difference to go from 15, 20, 25% management to 85, 90, 95% management. I mean, it's absolutely night and day. And at 85, 90, 95% management, I can live a really great life. And again, I have a wonderful wife. I have 3 great children. I have a side career that I enjoy. And all of that is possible because of managing that. So as we go back in time, I actually wanted to start off by sharing just a short excerpt from my patriarchal blessing. And as we know, as priesthood men, we don't cavalierly share our patriarchal blessing or even snippets from it. But on occasion, when prompted by the Spirit, it is appropriate to share certain things, especially that are more general and relevant to gospel teaching. And I wanted to share one of those because when I got my patriarchal blessing, I was 16 years old. And there was a line in there that really jumped out at me. And this is actually a little more of a personal line, but it's highly relevant to this subject. And it says, "I tell you, Jordan, that in many instances, your life will not be easy. There will be difficult decisions and challenging circumstances present themselves in your life. Perhaps challenges to your health and well-being, certainly challenges to your happiness." And when I read that at age 16, I panicked a little bit because I thought, what's in my future? Is it cancer? Is it heart disease? I mean, is it a car? I mean, who knows? Is it an accident? But interestingly enough, I had already been struggling with a lot of these mental things for 3 or 4 years by the time I got my patriarchal blessing.
was there a diagnosis or were you getting to
Yes.
that? Or
Yeah, I'm getting to that now. So at about 18 months after I received my patriarchal blessing, I'd already been struggling terribly for 3 or 4 years. It began when I was 12, 13 years old.
wow.
And my mental illness struggles focus on obsessive compulsive disorder, sometimes just shortened OCD. More people know it by the acronym OCD. And then there's also depression and anxiety that goes along with obsessions and compulsions. So it's kind of a triad of mental illness there. And I had been struggling terribly through my teens with these obsessive thoughts that just wouldn't go away, fears of germs. The very nature of OCD is whatever it is that you're afraid of or that you have a phobia for or that bothers you or that agitates you or that drives you crazy, your brain will keep thinking on a loop over and over again, and you can't get rid of them. And it's just devastating because you feel like you're losing your mind, like you with these thoughts. And I was struggling with this for 3 or 4 years in silence. because I certainly didn't want to, talk to anybody about it.
Well, and also you couldn't the Jensen family was the perfect Mormon family, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, I would imagine as a young man, you didn't wanna embarrass your family.
Well, not so much that, because at the time I was so young and naive about all of these things, and actually, fortunately, to my great blessing, my parents, I was pretty close to them, and in fact, I was close enough that I did finally go to them and tell them about all these thoughts that I was having, and to my everlasting gratitude, they were really kind and sweet and loving about it, and they tried to be reassuring, and my dad said things like, "Oh, Jordan, there's not a thought you've thought that I haven't thought a lot longer and a lot more of," which was very reassuring, but the problem is
And perhaps true.
oh, sure, but the problem is that we were not at all in sync with what was going on. He thought I was just a teenage boy. He had no recognition that I had obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's a totally different thing. And ironically, the last thing that you wanna do to someone with OCD is give them reassurance, because part of the therapy for OCD is something called exposure response therapy, where you actually have to do the counterintuitive thing of thinking of the thoughts more until they start to lose their power. And as I went through this journey, my parents were wonderful because they gave me a lot of love and kindness and compassion, but they just had no knowledge of mental illness. And so what they did was helped in the short run, but it actually made things even worse in the long run. And the first thing that I actually went to my parents about was I had an obsessive thought of denying the Holy Ghost, because I learned in Sunday school that denying the Holy Ghost is the worst sin you can commit, and you're damned to hell and a son of
There's
perdition if
no
that happen.
hope for the
That's
man who
right.
denies the Holy Ghost,
That's right. Now, as adults, we understand that it's very difficult
if not impossible.
to even become a son of perdition. I mean, you got to have a sure witness. You got to actively fight against, come out in open rebellion, say the sun doesn't exist when you're looking straight at it. I mean, all of these things as adults we know, but as a kid, I didn't. And I had this OCD thing, and all of a sudden I start obsessively thinking about denying the Holy Ghost because that's the worst possible thing my mind can concoct. And that's the kind of nefarious nature of OCD. It'll pick whatever terrorizes you the most, and then it'll put it on a replay loop. And so I went to my parents about that. That was the very, very first thing, even before the sexual thoughts. I went to my parents about that. And they were super reassuring. They're like, "Oh, you don't need to worry." They explained it to me, and I was like, "Oh, good. Well, at least that's over." But then that's when it went to sexual thoughts. And I didn't learn till many years later from a therapist that you can't give that kind of reassurance, because that actually plays into the cycle. Because there's a cycle with OCD. It's obsession, compulsion, relief, obsession, compulsion, relief, and that will continue to play unless you interrupt the pattern.
Mhm.
And in order to interrupt the pattern, it requires it exposing actually to the very thing. It's a very similar therapy that they use to help people overcome phobias, which is gradual exposure to the very thing that you're afraid of. If someone wants to overcome a fear of arachnophobia or a fear of heights, there's inevitably going to be some spiders and some tall buildings in that, because that's just the nature of the therapy. That's the way we overcome things. Now, you do it in a humane, gradual way. You don't take someone to the top of the Empire State Building on the first visit if they have a fear of heights. You don't bring out a tarantula on the first visit.
Put him on an episode of Fear Factor with Joe
Yeah.
Rogan, right?
Yeah, so these things, you work with a professional and you work step by step to overcome these things. But my parents knew nothing about any of this stuff. But what ended up happening, another blessing in disguise, one of the things that led to my parents' divorce is my dad had a bad case of bipolar disorder. And so bad that in my junior year in high school, he almost commit suicide. And it was really, really bad. But fortunately, he went and got professional help. And we were living in Utah at the time, and he was diagnosed by a psychiatrist at the University of Utah. And after he got this diagnosis, and this was about 18 months after my patriarchal blessing, and I started to putting two to two together. I said, you know what? Maybe my big trial in life won't necessarily be physical challenges, but it'll be a mental health challenge. And I started to realize, I know I don't have what my dad has because my symptoms are very different. But I wonder if there's something else by a different name that I have. having my dad diagnosed with bipolar opened up this whole new world to me that, oh, wow, you can be diagnosed with something wrong in your brain just like you can be diagnosed with something wrong in your body. And this was 1996, the fall of 1996. I was a junior in high school, and the internet was just coming of age, and it had just come to our little community, our rural community in southeastern Utah where I lived. And so, using my high school library and the basic internet that was there in the mid 90s, I did some research and I stumbled across OCD. And I was reading the symptoms. I'm like, bang, bang, bang. I mean, the bullet points, you go,
That's me, right?
yeah,
That's me. Check,
eg-
check.
exactly. And so fortunately, in January of 1997, again, my junior year of high school, I ended up going to the same psychiatrist that my dad had gone to. And he officially, like, he did all the questions and interview stuff that they have to do, and he officially diagnosed me. Sure enough, I was OCD, if not textbook OCD. And I went on medication for the first time there. And from there, 1997, we're looking at almost a 3-decade journey now. And, I could talk about this for hours and hours in great detail, but suffice it to say, over the next approximately 3 decades, I've been on a journey of managing my mental health. And that has involved a ton of work personally. I remember on my mission, well, I struggled on my mission. I struggled in my relationships with my companions. I struggled because, one of the worst things you could do to someone with bad OCD is to give them a thick book of rules. Because now, I was already very,
And force them to live with a stranger who might not have the same habits, right? Oh,
yeah,
I can only imagine how difficult.
because I had grown up in this strong Mormon family and had always kind of even had a personal testimony, for me, I was always kind of a rule keeper anyway, and I wanted to live the commandments. I wanted to keep the rules, but OCD takes that sort of stuff to a whole new level, to a way that's just irrational and quite frankly can be destructive of relationships. And in fact, to this day, I look back and I just shake my head with embarrassment and compassion to think of what some of my companions had to deal with because they had to deal with this person. In the mission, sometimes they use words like anal to refer to people that are really strict rule keepers. But that's the way I was. But it was more than just a strict rule keeper. It was obsessive to the extent that even my mission president recognized this kid needs help. And it's the kind of help that I can't give him. And so he referred me to LDS Family Services. And I was able to get 4 or 5 counseling sessions even on my mission. That was actually the most psychotherapy counseling that I had ever received up to that point. It was very helpful. I'll never forget my counselor telling me something. He said, when it comes to these rules and the relationships with your companionship, Elder Jensen, I want you to try and err on the side of love for your companion. In other words, he was teaching me that the rules are important, and yes, we need to keep the rules, but what I was doing was also very destructive of the relationship I had with my companion, and it was unnecessary. It's not something that the prophet or my mission president or even the rule book was asking me to do. It was me taking things to extremes. And this was the beginning of, not the beginning, but it was the extension of this journey of psychotherapy that would go on, for the next 3 decades. And I'll never forget my mission president, a couple of things that he told me. Number one, he told me, he said, Elder Jensen, I want you to remember that OCD has not been all bad for you. He said, you're a very obedient, hardworking elder, and we appreciate that. And that is a positive component of your OCD. Yeah, sometimes it gets out of hand, but it also creates some positive things in your life. And that was a beautiful thing because I realized, and I realize this more and more now, that there were some gifts that I had mentally, socially, oratorically, organizationally, that the OCD was fueling. But unbridled, it kind of exploded and became a mess. But when bridled, it could be very powerful.
A great strength.
And it's allowed me to do things in my career that are extraordinary, not because I'm extraordinary, but because that diamond, that grain of sand agitating that, what is it, oyster? Is it oyster, nickel, pearl? You get the metaphor. it was that OCD was like the grain of sand.
Sure.
And it took a long time, but it eventually created some pearls in my life and career.
Sure.
So I was really grateful for that. But another thing my mission president said that I really appreciate and that really scared me, frankly, he said, Elder Jensen, this is going to impact your ability as a husband and a father. And I took that as a really important warning because I realized that, wow, he's right. Just as I've struggled in these relationships with my companions because of OCD, it's going to be the same kind of thing with my wife if I don't get a really good handle on this. In fact, even worse, I may never get married at all. In fact, statistics show people with OCD, severe OCD that isn't well managed, they tend to not get married. It's difficult for them. It's difficult to form intimate relationships because of the symptoms are so hard on the other partner. And if my wife were here, as well as I have learned to manage it, she'll still tell you there's some pet peeves she has that are still rooted in OCD. I mean, it's still not 100% gone, but fortunately, I did get to the point. But the reason I got to the point where I could get married and have a family and live a normal life is because after my mission, I remember I had a really heartbreaking romantic letdown about 4 or 5 months after I got home from my mission. And I got rejected by this girl, and it devastated me, but it also drove me back into counseling. And I was going to Utah Valley State College, now UVU at the time, and I was living in off-campus BYU housing, and BYU had a clinic called the Comprehensive Clinic, where you could go and get quasi-professional therapy from graduate students they weren't fully licensed yet, but they were close. They were on the way. They were authorized to give professional counseling at a drastically reduced rate. And I was broke as a joke as a college student, but I could afford $15 a session. And those of you that know anything about professional counseling, it's not cheap. Out in the real world, it can run, 150, 200, sometimes even $300 an hour. But I got it for $15 a session, and I started going regularly. And for about 10 months, I hit it really hard on a regular basis. I was just determined. I said, whatever it takes, I'm going to learn to manage this thing, because if I don't, I may never get married. I may never have children. I may never be able to be successful in my career. I may be dramatically held back in my life and career if I don't take full responsibility for this. And that means I had to go and get help.
So that doesn't strike me as a normal reaction based on my personal experience, right? When I've had challenges like that that I faced, my first reaction was not, I'm going to tackle this head on and do everything I can to deal with this right now so that this doesn't affect me later in my life. My reaction was to run and hide and avoid. What was it that was different that you think you had that, head on attitude? What was it that gave you the ability to be able to decide to tackle this head on instead of run and hide?
It's a great question. And before you officially award me with the Superman cape, keep in mind, when I went and proactively got this counseling on my own, I had already been into this a full decade. So that wasn't my initial response. I mean, for the first 4 years, I didn't even dare tell anybody about it except for my mom and dad. They're the only ones that I would even dare open up about it. So I don't want to posture myself as some hero when I'm really not. The truth is it took me a long time, just like most people. And it took me even longer, perhaps, because I didn't have a support system who understood what I was going through. I had a great support system. My mom and dad were actually great. They just knew nothing about mental illness. And my dad was struggling with his own mental illness with the bipolar. And so, by the time I was doing this, I had already been to several counselors. I'd been to counseling on my mission, and I was growing, I was learning, and I was at the point where I knew this is what I have to do. And there was a very real fear because I really wanted to get married. It's always been a really high priority for me, partly because of the gospel for sure, and the promises of the temple and that, but partly because it's just what I really wanted. I really wanted a romantic relationship that was long term, that was committed. I really wanted to have all of those wonderful adventures and joys in my life, and I knew that this issue could potentially prevent me from getting that. And and the truth is that even with all of this help that I was getting and getting on medication, I still was almost 29 years old before I got married. I mean, it took me a long time. I am several years older than my wife, and I often joke to people that, I had to wait until I was 28, 29 to be mature enough for her.
Sure.
She was unusually mature for her age, and she also didn't have these mental health issues. And but interestingly enough, she had a sibling and a best friend who did have mental issues, and so she actually was kind of prepared to meet
What do you know?
to have to deal with me,
What do you know? The
later
Lord
on.
has a
The
design.
Lord really does have a design, and so it was very powerful. But one of the most important parts of this story is that even after I'd gotten all this help, even after being on medication, in the last 20 years, I have had a number of different relapses. In fact, most recently, just earlier this year, I had a relapse that put me back into therapy. And since 2011, I have been on medication consistently. Every single night, last night before bed, I took 2 different medications, part of the pharmacotherapy, the medicinal treatment that my psychiatrist has prescribed for me. And I got back into psychotherapy. I'm always on medication. I'm only in psychotherapy now when I need it.
Are you aware that most people would be afraid to talk about these things openly?
Oh, for sure.
Why are you so unafraid? And I would say courageous. It's uncommon for a person to be speaking of these things, especially in a public setting like this, where other people may not only hear it, but then they're going to judge me, right, based on this. And we know that that's true. We know that people judge because we are people, right, JJ?
Sure.
Why aren't you scared to talk about these things, especially in the church, the culture of the church, right? You're in a leadership calling. Aren't you scared?
That's a great question. I honestly, I'd love to say that, I'm courageous and I'm a great guy and that's why I do it. But to be honest, I have to acknowledge the hand of the Lord all throughout. Because again, for the first several years, I was terrified to say anything about it. And for a long time after that, I kept it very private between, personal family and friends and my counselor. So, this has only been the last 10 or 15 years where I've really become open about this stuff. And the reason I have, to be frank, again, I don't think it's because I'm so courageous or because I'm so noble. I think it's because the Lord has blessed me with a really unique personal and professional situation that makes it possible. Meaning, I'm a stay-at-home dad. My wife has a really successful career. So, me being open about this, it's not going to cause me to lose my job. It's not going to, there aren't going to be any serious consequences. And I recognize and I empathize that with other people, sometimes there are, and that contributes to the stigma, that contributes to the difficulty. And one of the reasons that I'm very open about it now, aside from being blessed to have a situation where it's conducive to doing so, is because I really want to erode that stigma. I'd love for people who listen to this to maybe only have to suffer in silence for 2 years instead of 4 years like I did, or maybe 2 months or 2 weeks even, It's and the beautiful thing about this day and age, another reason I feel comfortable about talking about it is because the culture has allowed me to. Would I have done this in 1985? Probably not. Would I have done this in 1955? Certainly not. No one would have been interested and I would have been, sent to the asylum or whatever. And so it's also circumstantial and good timing. I mean, the Lord has blessed me to be in a day and age where the culture is not only more open to it, but where they're even, seeking out and giving people a platform for this. And for you, I just want to say thank you for that because that's a blessing for me to be able to, because I think the Lord wants me to help others so that they perhaps won't have to suffer as much as I did. Or even though there will be some suffering, that they'll have some hope, that they'll recognize that there's a way out, there's a way through.
Yes, and that's a question I wanted to ask you. So, for anyone, JJ, that may be watching this podcast who is in the midst of that pain and suffering, what would you say to offer some hope to that person who doesn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, that hopeless feeling that we felt?
I think the most important thing, first of all, is to get down on your knees and to ask the Lord for help. I believe in the power of prayer. I recognize and I acknowledge that prayer and fasting and temple attendance and the prayer roll at the temple, all of the spiritual things that we believe in, that we put our faith in, those have been part of my healing treatment. Not healing, management. I don't like to use the word healing because it's not accurate. My management of it. And I attribute a lot of it to that. So that's step one. Step two is find someone, a mortal that you trust and love and that you know is a safe place, and open up to them about it. And, what breaks my heart is that I know that there's some people that may feel like there is no one like that. That's one of the biggest tragedies of all. And that can be challenging for some in extreme circumstances. But most people can find at least one person that they have enough trust in that they're willing to open up about these things. And, that's where you can start to get help. Even though my parents didn't know anything about OCD or exposure response treatment, I knew that they were a safe place to open up to. And even though they were doing the wrong thing to help me, it was through my parents that I ended up going and seeing the psychiatrist and getting the initial help that I needed professionally. So I was super blessed because while my parents were by no means experts on mental health, they were an avenue, a safe place where I could begin that journey. And everybody needs that, whether it's a bishop, whether it's a mom or a dad or an aunt or an uncle or a friend or a teacher, a coach or a counselor at school, a principal. Find that one person. And I promise you that if you'll take those two steps, that the Lord will help you the rest of the way. But the rest of the way isn't going to be easy. It's going to, in most cases, it will be long, it will be drawn out, and you make progress a piece and a slice at a time. And you have to be patient with yourself, and you have to recognize that it's not like, tomorrow or Thursday, I'm going to be having a knee surgery to repair a torn meniscus. And the doctor's going to go in there. He's going to suture it all up. And in 4 to 6 weeks, I'll be back running. Running's one of my loves. And it's hard to do it right now with
The pain.
the torn meniscus. And isn't that a beautiful miracle of our modern technology? Wouldn't it be fantastic if a doctor could perform a lobotomy and fix whatever's wrong with my brain? It's not that simple.
They used to think they could, from what I understand.
and sometimes they did even more damage. So unfortunately, we don't have yet the tools that can create that 4 to 6 week healing like you can in the knee. And so don't expect that. But at the same time, have hope and recognize that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but that tunnel is likely to be longer than you would like. And so mentally prepare yourself for an extended journey, and then take joy and satisfaction with the little victories along the way. But if you remain determined, if you remain committed to it, both self-help, spiritual help, and professional help when and where needed, then I promise you that it will get better, and you will make progress, and there will be hope. And you don't have to, you can learn to manage mental illness rather than having mental illness manage or even control you. And I've experienced both sides of the fence, and one is really great and the other is just terrifyingly awful.